Many people are inspired by the ongoing protests that are happening in the last few weeks since George Floyd's death. And in many of your listeners' home countries, people of all backgrounds have been, as you said, rising up, coming to the streets. And despite the particular dangers of the COVID-19 pandemic, and people are sharing sorrow, they're sharing anger and sentiments of solidarity around the world. But this has a very long history. And it's important to recognize that these protests are not only about Mr. Floyd himself and but many people have known around in the U.S. and around the world for centuries that there's a problem with race-based police brutality and widespread anti-Black violence more generally. Many scholars and activists trace the origins of U.S. policing back to slave patrols during the time of slavery. So when some people are looking at these phenomena, they're seeing a through line going all the way back to a time when it was legal to own people. And also going along with that in terms of things that have escalated police brutality, in many jurisdictions, police departments have become increasingly militarized. You can trace that back to the 60s and the 70s, but it really has also picked up a lot really in the last several decades.
Speaking of 1968, because that is the year that a lot of people are drawing parallels to, because you look online and you see pictures of police lines, you see pictures of protesters. As a historian of American history, what are you seeing as potential parallels, similarities, and any discrepancies or differences?
Historians are always talking about context. You'll hear from most of us, no two times are the same. So I would say there definitely are parallels, but there are limits to those parallels between these historical moments. You can see parallels in the sense that they're both moments in which people have risen up against multiple sources of oppression, including a strong movement by African Americans and like-minded folks against what we now call structural racism. In both eras, freedom of assembly has been absolutely vital, and the crackdown on freedom of expression and police violence against protesters has inspired more people to take to the streets. The uprisings in 1968 were most directly triggered by the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., but they were also part of a long-running wave of protest about civil rights and about the Vietnam War, among other issues. Of course, notoriously, you're talking about the images, the 1968 Democratic Convention was rife with police conflict with protesters. And as an outcome of the turmoil in 1968, Richard Nixon, who was the Republican candidate for president that year, was able to present himself as a law and order man and claim the nation would be safer in his hands in the future, was able to become president that year, of course. In terms of the current sitting president, Donald Trump has an overtly pro-policing approach in terms of his messages. And for decades, he has identified with that law and order kind of stance. We can date this back to his pre-political days in New York, most notably his actions in the 1989 Central Park 5 case.
It's very interesting to see how these effects of these protests are bringing about change almost seemingly more rapidly than those in 1968.
Certainly, and that is something that many people are taking heart from. Many people are drawing solidarity from the visible results they're seeing from the protests. These include such results as the arrests and the increase in charges of the officers involved in George Floyd's killing and the cancellation of contracts in police forces for schools in Minnesota and in other jurisdictions. So there are actually lists circulating of, look at all these things that are happening, look at this rapid action. And it does seem to be perhaps between the scale of the protests and their global nature, and also possibly the role of technology in circulating all sorts of information, that this moment has the potential for outcome.
And lasting change, perhaps.
Perhaps, yes.
All right. Dr. Dana Weiner is an associate professor of American history at Wilfred Laurier University in Waterloo, Canada. Thank you very much for taking time out of your day to speak with us.
Thank you.